Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Milan for our historical region series. Last time we made a video about the city until the 13th century, so we restart from here. Naturally, Milanese history is embarrassingly complex and rich and sort of difficult, and especially when it gets down to the Italian communes, it's sort of difficult even to find a specific track to follow because there are republican tendencies, in spite of course, of all the oligarchic, eventually essentially the autocratic dynastic, what they call tyranny, especially in the case of Milan, but in a positive sense, by their own saying, is naturally requiring many more videos. I realize I haven't made so much about Milan or Lombardy and Schwerpunkt, at least considering the historical relevance proportionally, and so we will surely come back on this likely soon. And some of you asked me some more, especially Italian Renaissance or the Condottieri era, and so Milan being quite central in many ways. So today we summarize briefly this history, leaving out, say, sort of all the details about every single ruler, but overall, because again, it's also a matter of what happens around, and we already presented part of this through the first part, right, of this video. So if we look at the early 13th century, Milan is really booming, right, in the era between the two Lombard Leagues, which in fact the city had been protagonist, the actual engine behind the whole thing, at least the leader, all right, of this great mass of Lombard moral and material resources that at some point had and would naturally be turned against one another if you look at the single politics of each commune, but that in the moment of course, a general threat, like it could be the Hohenstaufen's attempts to centralize Germanic rule on the Po Valley, they would gather the same forces and even succeed in repelling the imperial attempt. Always bear in mind that these were proud imperial subjects, right? That thought to have specific rights, especially considering that most of what would have had to be given and trusted to the German officials would have really corresponded to the entirety of their political autonomy, right? If you look at the details of it all, it's not just to say, well, it's just about a normal cooptation or whatever. This is something that was advised, in fact, also by the same Lombards to Frederick II, and we will see now. But that was the point of no return, in fact. Much more was asked also because the Hohenstaufen had invested an enormous amount of political capital, we can say, even before, of course, the financial one. We have seen, of course, how the first Lombard League had ended successfully with the Peace of Constance, the Milanese protagonism at the Battle of Legnano, and all that series of prerogatives that were, in fact, stabilized starting from there, even when the clashes with the emperor would begin again. They had been representing quite an important precedent, right? And in between the two Lombard League wars, because technically there is a historiographical tendency to think that the Lombard League was something just like called every once in a while, or for specifically the this clashes with the emperor, but it wasn't really like that. The cities were already connected with one another, and the Lombard League, specifically the Tuscans, had something similar. The first one had actually been the one in the Veneto Mark, right? So there were many, but fundamentally Milan would reinstate this league at every useful expedition. It was a bit normal just to consider such say union of forces in the first place. And when you see like the first and second Lombard League and their end, so that the final victory of the Guelphs, you can measure afterwards the literal explosion right, the boom into basically any single civilizational indicator that was invested also brutally in fighting against one another, whatever, but in an incredible political, in fact, military and social power. Right, Milan in the early 13th century was already well organized, as we've seen, in quite of a corporatistic way to protect its own, especially its centrality across the European and actually intercontinental trade routes that connected, in fact, with Central Europe with the Mediterranean, the East, the West, right? So the largest city in Europe, as a matter of fact, we do not understand precisely whether it was Paris or Milan, but the scale, in fact, was the same. And we're talking multiple hundreds of thousands of people. Depending on the estimates, they do vary, but there is no doubt about their primate. Now, it was, of course, a lot of industry in Milan, as it basically would be maintained historically, and still this is one of the most industrialized areas in Europe still today. Trade industries, particularly the one of metals and wool, right? We will make a video about the so-called Milanese Lombard armor. It was not just about Milan producing it; it was produced as such as Italian armor in general throughout the entire peninsula. But Milan, Brescia had the best business models, the best administered, in fact, production, the best accessibility to resources, which the cities were quite jealous, and especially providing them a hell of a investment capacity, also in war, in the acquisition of also other communes' government. This is essentially the main dynamic in the 13th century. We've seen how the first Lombard League had been called initially just, of course, to defend from the Hohenstaufen, but that the first Barbarossa intervention in Italy had been triggered by the Milanese attempt to conquer Lodi and neighboring communes, which was something insane for the time's standards, because no commune like in Europe had mostly that capacity. It started from there, and Milanese power during the 14th centuries, we will see now, will gradually overlap with the entirety of Lombardy, essentially the Milanese hegemony on these other communes. And so the foundations of a true regional state, right, that tended to hegemonize essentially not just northern but also parts of central Italy, aside from the dynastic swings of the Visconti and, of course, the sort of decentralized rule that is entailed in the fringes. So it's in the 13th century that we notice the rise of the della Torre or Torriani family that would play such a significant role in the city politics before the Visconti, and also during their actual emergence. It was a fanatic competition, as we'll see now, between these families. These were, as usual, some powerful aristocratic clans that in Milan had been fully integrated in the communal government hierarchy, people with lands, with house towers, with retinues, etc. Pagano is the first character active in Milanese politics by the time of the Second Lombard League. So here's the war with Frederick II that takes on essentially his grandfather's mask in everything. Like Frederick had, we made so many videos about him, he had very different ways of coping with various peoples depending on the circumstance. Also, the ferocity he displayed would trigger, again, ferocious resistance in return. In 1237, after the Lombard defeat at the hands of the Imperials at Cortenuova, in Pontida, Pagano gained an incredible opportunity to strengthen his political grip on Milan, because he basically provided refuge to the relics of the same Ambrosian army defeated, Actually, they abandoned the field at night after having resisted like for hours against the imperial cavalry charges, and that's how tough, in fact, also the Lombard infantry had continued to be since the times of Carcano or Legnano. But again, in the 13th century, knightly warfare is at the peak of its technical capacity. The Lombards, of course, were led by their own knights, but the Germans and the Italian Ghibellines were stronger than them. Just the resistance of the infantry in that way is exceptional by those time standards. Pagano hosted the survivors of the Milanese army in his own estates in Valsassina. These are all places in the surroundings of Milan, or at least hegemonized many ways by this growing power. Right, there were other centers around it had already been fallen as towns under the Milanese edges. For these, so of course Pagano was standing heavily already in the Guelph field, even though it was not mandatory here. The clash took on a much more international value, aside from the divisions that existed within the same Lombardy. And for his merits, he was appointed elder of the credence of Sant'Ambrogio, as well as captain of the people of Milan in 1240. Right, this made him historiographically a bit the first lord of Milan, even though there wasn't such a thing like a signory yet. I have actually incoming, thanks to the randomness of the cycle, two videos about the 13th century Italian signories that are sort of less, they're definitely overlooked compared, of course, to the more famous ones of the 14th and 15th century. But it's important to, in fact, to understand how they started. All right, here Milan has, this always happened. There's a defeat of some sort, there's a political crisis within the city, they need a strong man. And so they choose this guy, who maintained essentially this office given by the Milanese councils until his death on January the 6th, 1241. And during his rule, Pagano managed to establish a wide range of connections, of alliances, for example, the ones with Venice and Genoa, expanding domestically the Milanese census, at the same time lowering taxes to appease citizens in this time of strains. Of course, this was a bit of a dual way of going. There was a tendency by the great lords of Lombardy to sort of disarm the citizenry, and or in fact to integrate in the army some more private professional forces compared to the militia levy. And we have observed how in Milan that there is never, differently from other Italian communes, this is a bit typical of Lombardy as a whole, never a popular government. Right, the people does exist, but it's always there next to the nobility and the archbishop as well, and it's always like this game of the three cards, but never in the sense that one manages to fully control the landscape until properly the signory takes over with the Visconti. Well, yeah, gradually you can choose when this happened first, but it still relied on the support of these groups altogether. In May of the same 1241, the people of Pavia, neighboring Milan, and being among the concerned of those who, so the Ambrosian expansionism threatening their own existence, their independence at least, and that were in fact at the time Ghibellines, right, allies with the emperor, attacked the same Milan. There were other attacks by Frederick II that, again, after Cortenuova had for a while the upper hand on the situation, could infest the Milanese district, could try to tear down the city in a way or another. On May the 26th, 1247, during the usual consular quarrels within the credence of Sant'Ambrogio. This was, as we've seen in the previous video, some councils, right? The consuls were the supreme magistrates of the commune, right? And they had to just, again, parliament into these other assemblies and deliberate, right? So there was yet another period of crisis, right? And this was particularly intense, not just because of the clash with the emperor, but the fact that the communes were tending towards an increased statalization. This was particularly evident in Milan, also because it was such a big city. And so much more was at stake. At this point were issues between various groups, let's say, horizontal. The other issues were more vertical. Instead, the lock of the knighthood, for example, the expansion of the people. And there was, at this point, a further step in favor of Martino della Torre, that was ordered as elder of the council by Gregorio de Montelongo, and Martino was Pagano's nephew, which naturally aggrandized the power of their house. Following further disturbances, to say the least, in Milan, another figure, Manfredo Lancia, was appointed to the government of the city. We are in 1253, so here we are actually after the major imperial wave that, with the death of Frederick II, sort of went down significantly, but not yet before 1266. And in fact, the della Torre's fortunes were still stay here. In any case, Manfredo left the office of elder of the credence of Sant'Ambrogio 3 years later, which led to Martino della Torre taking over at this point as podestà, an office that, as we've seen in the numerous videos about the Italian communes, was designed to bring a sort of arbitrate over the same councils. This is kind of strange because the podestà in theory and just originally and also later was usually a foreigner, at least somebody from another Italian commune, that very often far away in another region, that would be thus hopefully impartial. Here instead we have the affirmation of Martino as such powerful post that entail also mostly a military capacity, as it was about the justice mostly, but it had to be enforced, and so this was providing the character with more power. This office was held between 1255-57, and it also did not settle the issues of the city per se. It paradoxically created a power vacuum that sparked new internal conflicts, because it was seen as, these guys taking over, and the main issues were at least stopped as a truce signed in Parabiago in 1257. Parabiago, again, these are all towns near Milan, right, and they recur in Milanese history. There was also the so-called Peace of Sant'Ambrose in 1258, which, however, in spite of the holy auspicium, lasted only 3 months, telling you how divided the community was. In 1259, Martino, that in the meanwhile had become podestà of Como, as it was completely normal, like these guys had so many connections, they were supporting in different cities, and of course it was very important for a commune like Como in the north of Milan that did not have excessive power in itself, and the Milanese also wanted to control because of the passage further north towards Germany, would support this political figure that, when reinstalled in Milan, could have rewarded those who had backed who had backed them before. And in fact, with this support, the same people of Como, right? He entered Milan with an army, right, consisting of these guys and other followers, of course, other Milanese exiles. This is really typical. This was effectively a march on Milan, so much so that Martino was granted dictatorial powers at that point to fight a Milanese enemy. Again, always the same story. You are conferred this power not because you can even just hold them so easily, but because the city is kind of in trouble. We will see again in the incoming videos the figure of Ezzelino da Romano. I think I made a video about him once, but again, have to talk this figure much more about. This was essentially a former wealth from a noble feudal family. We talk about this mostly in the videos about the history of Verona, and that, however, just out of sheer convenience and substantial subsidy, was co-opted to the Ghibelline cause by the same Frederick II. In fact, he's credited together with Oberto Pallavicino and another few as the really one of the first real lords, right, in Italian history. This guy essentially began to rule in the Adige Valley from Verona, subjugating also other neighboring cities of the Trevisan Mark on behalf of the emperor. He also married Manfred of Sicily's daughter, so he was really involved with the Hohenstaufen, and he was threatening Milan. Not in a general sense of landmass or whatever, but essentially this political game that would have brought these figures now to the rule of different cities at a time, with all different mechanisms that, in fact, at the time were not called like lordship or whatever, because it would have been just contrary to the communal constitutions, etc., but that de facto were accumulating this power in the hands of this guy. It was, again, essentially accumulating enough surplus to concentrate your power in one city, naturally the one you came from normally, because you would be more powerful yourself in order to be there in the first place, and yes, the others are receiving your protection, militarily speaking, paying their due, but not seeing you too much around in the same place. This guy was incredibly powerful, though, and the Milanese wanted to get rid of him. So much so that under the della Torre, Ezzelino is defeated and killed at the Battle of Cassano d'Adda in 1259. He got wounded in a foot, eventually was transported away. He died of septicemia later on. It was quite common, quite nicely explored. Most of Ezzelino's life is clothed with the Dark Legend by a later Paduan author, that is Albertino Mussato, who came from a city that was very, very wealthy in nature, very popular, and sort of remember Ezzelino's times as, dark, because he was a Ghibelline tyrant in their view, and so there's a bit like the monstrous legion of the guy. Sure, he was quite violent and ruthless, but also an effective leader, not, say, darker at all than the normality of that time. And this clash was quite relevant because it's also sanctioned, as you understand, further Taurian power in Milan. In fact, Martino, thanks to the victory at Cassano, was proclaimed by the credence of Sant'Ambrose as properly lord, establishing this tradition of sort of autocracy in the city. After Martino's death in 1263, the popular favor ensured that his brother, Filippo della Torre, was also granted the renewal of at least exceptional powers, was mostly the cumulation of different offices, charges, titles, subsidies, whatever, and naturally there was a lot of private power backing this, just in the family. The lordly regime was maintained de facto until Oberto Pellavicino, that we met before. This guy was from the Parmesan area. This was a place where the Pellavicini had a massive seigneurial lordship in the countryside. It sort of interfered with Parma as well, that were in fact interested as feudal nobility into also some cooptation from the side of the empire. Here things are changing, as we will see now with the rise of the Angevins in Italy. And there was some cooperation already to clash against other figures, like we've seen the same Ezzelino Romano. For example, Oberto Pellavicino obtained the lordship, had obtained himself for some time the lordship over Milan, just generally. Like these things were sort of going on since the Italic kings, right? That they could hegemonize 1/3 of the Po Valley, but it was pretty much it, and every city was still retaining power in many ways. So Oberto Pellavicino died in 1269, and this brought to the further strengthening of the della Torre family, because it was yet another competitor out of place. And this was also a moment of further consolidation of the family, probably in the Italian political landscape, given that in 1266 Charles of Anjou had conquered the Kingdom of Sicily. 2 years later, he essentially and literally beheaded the Hohenstaufen inheritance rights after the Battle of Tagliacozzo, and extended, in fact, a Guelph Angevin hegemony over most of Italy. Right, the Angevins were very at this point, the way you see with the crisis of the Germanic Empire, it wasn't much of an need even to pressure to be like to iron-fisted or exacting from these communes too much money. Charles of Anjou himself was lord of this or that commune in the Po Valley, but it mostly got down to, okay, you pay me a bit of money to maintain some knights in the city, and if there is some major war, I will essentially gather forces and clash against the sacks of Ghibelline power that had been remaining in the city, in the region. Milan was at this point wealth because of the della Torre Signory that was, as we've seen, supported by the same Charles, and it was a moment of great prosperity for Milan as well. Right, the Angevin Agit brought to again an end of the major clashes that had occurred under the presence of Manfred, that tried to Germanize the entire peninsula, but also in a more pugnacious way. I made a video about him. We must talk about him again, because it's one of the single most underrated figures in medieval history. And this brought to naturally actually lots more of wars in the Po Valley, but that were at least ending in one another, just to the favor of one of the locals, right? So allowing him to centralize, to strengthen further, and this was very much the case of Milan, by far the strongest city in the Po Valley, right? But again, this communal politics was very fluid. When one guy reached too much power, the citizenry got fed up, or at least there were important clashes, and that's when the Visconti rise. They were traditionally Ghibellines. They didn't come from a very powerful background, but in the 70s, you have the Archbishop of Milan being elected among from this clan, Ottone Visconti, who really worked admirably to support the prerogatives of his family and fostering their power to seize control of the same Milan, naturally clashing against the della Torre. Right. Again, nothing particular about these guys up to that point. They emerged from a quite modest background, a castle from the shores of the Lake of Como, but they really rose that fast and eventually riding the wave of discontent against this autocratic rule of the della Torre, and receiving surely support both by the Ghibelline, the Germanic axis. Consider at this point again, most of northern Italy is hegemonized politically by the Angevins, which means that they weren't really there, but they enjoyed their protection. So if some Ghibelline supported by the Germans, say, had arisen and just would have disturbed the status quo, the Angevins would have sent from Naples some mercenaries. They would have essentially been fighting, and there were different clashes actually that at some point, think about the Roccavione, as a sort of undermined the same Angevin hegemony, and so that's why the Visconti are actually very interesting in this sense. In 1277, Ottone Visconti defeated Napo della Torre finally in a true battle, the one of Desio. Napo della Torre was the leader of the popular Guelph faction and de facto at that point the ruler of the city. And the Battle of Desio again marked the first rise of the Visconti. There would be an interludium, as we'll see now, where the della Torre managed to come back in power. And in fact, this first phase of Visconti rule was a bit wavering as well. Ottone favored his great-grand-nephew Matteo as captain of the Milanese people in 1287. So you have the church from your side. You entrust this guy with the probably the command of the Popolo paramilitary forces that within the city gates have a hell of a potential and deterrent capacity. You can see among these clashes, of course, the definitive decline of the freer commune, right, of Milan as such. The signory is just in the air. It's just consolidating. In fact, the same Visconti, aside from, like we'll see now, a few issues, seized power at this point, ruling the city until 1447. Furthermore, the King of the Romans, Adolf of Nassau, in 1294 grants the imperial vicariate to the same Matteo Visconti. He was a quite effective ruler. The vicariate would later pass down through the various family members. Again, the Visconti would be the imperial boys. This is quite relevant because it shows you how it's not that they were particularly, Germanophile, or they were asking for an imperial expedition that, when happening, actually would cause problems to themselves as well. They wanted their autonomy. They were the rulers of Milan first and foremost, right? And this from the head of the Lombard League, the most Guelph powers, ultra backed by the papacy and so on. So Milan at this point changes from Guelph to Ghibelline, right, with the della Torre Visconti switch. By being appointed as the imperial representative, the Lord of Milan demonstrated that his power was not solely based on the consent of the citizens, but also on a delegation granted by the sovereign, so with a much greater international recognition and also local legitimization. And in all this, Milan is actually prospering, because as we've seen, without breaks, without the Angevins do not really intervene either, or they really can't, even against the Visconti, because Milan is a major power. So we'll have to make multiple videos about the actually atrocious fights that were going on within the same northern Italy between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, but they were, of course, proportionate to some provincial situation, a commune or the other, right? So it was always like every few years the theater of hostilities would change. Everything was intertwined. There were always some sort of 2 or 3 wars every year going on with some relevant battles. But of course, a full war, like a campaign against Milan, like the popes would attempt in the early 14th century, would never be carried out by the Angevins. Not even, in fact, at the peak of their power. And Milan was enlarging as a city as well. There is an impressive description by the Milanese chronicler Bonvesin della Riva that lists all the mills, all the armorers, all the, like, it gives you an idea of the sheer wealth of this city. In 1272, the Ticinello Canal was made navigable and became what is today the Great Naviglio. Milan is surrounded, as we've seen also in the video, just like about the origin of Celtic Midland, etc., by river, water courses that intertwine also among each other. They had yet in part to be canalized, and all this was done infrastructure in a way to serve the greater logistical, strategical needs of the city. The construction of the Great Naviglio had begun in 1179. This canal connected essentially the Ticino and Adda rivers through the Martesana Canal. Again, these are all areas that the Martesana is in northwest of Milan. There are various, like even forests areas still. Again, we're talking medieval Europe after all, but the works here carried out are enormous in scale. At the time, the Great Naviglio ended at the pond of Sant'Ambrogio. Eventually, a veritable dock would be built in front of the Ticino Gate. Right, this was in fact near to the Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio, from which the same Naviglio ended. The basilica was just outside the medieval Ticino Gate. The canal extended there in 1211 as an additional, but still non-navigable section of the Ticinello Canal. And this would be better explained, of course, with some maps. But say just to give you the idea of how you can say like Venice, that of course was properly on different islands on the lagoon, etc. But how surrounded by water that this really the medieval Milan really was. The city was divided into 6 neighborhoods, known for this reason as sestieri, and in turn 30 contrade, so some again proper neighborhoods within these districts. These subdivisions were very old. At least there we find them for the first time in the Middle Ages, but as we've seen, there was a great deal of continuity from antiquity as well. Today they're factually disappeared. Like in the 19th century, the city changed so much, at least that the original communities would not identify like that on that specific districtuation basis. Then, of course, the city was expanded in very more sort of monumental ways. Of course, what as we notice also for other cities, the medieval phase very much is lost, right? In some, aside from some important structures, of course. These districts were, however, and obviously limited to the borders of today's historical center of Milan, because the city eventually arrived up to there. In fact, they were delimited by the Naviglia Circle, which was originally the defensive moat of the medieval walls of Milan, right? And so again, the city surrounded by water as well for defensive purposes. The sestieri were traditionally, like in other cities, named after the main city gates with their respective coat of arms, which were carried into battle by the communal troops of Milan along with the city's flag. The Milanese were quite proud, not just of their city, but especially the popular element, displaying a great sense of their strength, right? Symbolized by the carroccio that at times was also taken by the imperial troops. But again, of course, this being a normal, I mean, think a bit about the organization of the Italian communal armies, and that's quite explicative. Consider always the material wealth involved. We will surely make some videos about probably the arms and armor of these guys. We made something about the broader region, but never quite the setting in the details of the infantry, so were quite tough. Meanwhile, Milan had kept on growing. By the 13th century, it was again one of the few European cities to have over 100,000 inhabitants. Craftsmanship was flourishing, particularly as we've seen in the field of metal and fabric manufacturing. It would consolidate further into the later Middle Ages. Also, agriculture and livestock as the primary sources of supply for the city were thriving. Trade was bustling thanks to it, but also in part as we've seen the construction of the Naviglio, the great Naviglio that facilitated the exchanges, and so also cleverly irrigated the surrounding countryside. So this by far, and since the early Middle Ages, one of the single most advanced actually area in Europe, together with northern France, fundamentally. So in terms of land of exploitation, but especially industries, which were not present as much as in other regions. It was by far the most industrialized in Europe. Then the Visconti are at some point overthrown, right, in 1302, if I'm not wrong, by the della Torre that managed to come back on Milan, naturally supported by the Angevins that have been battling together with the Guelphs with Ghibelline forces. The part of the fall of the Visconti seems to have been due to the fact to the great expansionistic policy that they were carrying out. They were essentially asking a lot to the citizens, and in fact these are the last years in which you see a strong popular participation to military expeditions of Milan. This is also the time which, in fact, the Milanese commune manages to absorb many others around gradually, but still one by one, demilitarizing that, getting their money, especially the Milanese bankers, cashing that and backing further political expansion. But at some point there is a populistic force that says, no, we don't usual BS, like we don't want to make war, to pay for it, whatever. And in fact this brings the della Torre back, that instead have a much more oligarchic policy thereon. They do prevent they do, like in that perspective, actually allow the citizens not to go to war, which entailed surely expenses that were quite costly, no doubt. But in this sense also demilitarized the masses. The oligarchs rose in power, also mercenaries. What happens, however, is in 1311 to 1312, the arrival of Henry VII, that, as you know, basically changed as King of the Romans, and eventually as he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the same orbs, the political geography of northern Italy, because it's in fact not until him that the Angevin hegemony is swept away from northern Italy, that recompacts to the most under Ghibelline rule. Right, you have here still tens of city-states that are clashing against one another, mostly in these two blocks, and so you do have still some wealth, but here proportionally the situation flips, right? The Visconti come back to Milan in the process. They receive the imperial vicariate, the della Torre they actually have to welcome the Emperor in Milan, which is kind of funny, because also they get insulted by it. There's a German knight that arrives and picks because the della Torre had been waiting for the imperial forces outside the city gates, and this guy arrives, picks the della Torre banner and throws it into the mud. Right, eventually the Visconti enter Milan together with Henry, and who also, as you know, confers the same vicariate to the della Scala in northeastern Italy, and this would become, in fact, the two major Ghibelline forces in the area. And so here the Milanese come back. The Ghibelline regime, the Visconti had been hiding in Lombardy against various supporters here and there in the countryside, etc. They made some sorties to try to harass the della Torre, but for 10 years they stayed out as exiles. This phase is very active because the Visconti are heavily involved into the wars that happen later as the Guelphs, the papacy, the Angevins strike back, and so there is in the early 20s of the 14th century also a crusade waged against Milan by Pope John the 22nd. I made a video about this in a video that was incidentally about ecclesiastical history, papal history. We'll have to talk about this politically and militarily. At this point, the same Visconti, because of the enormous military expenses, had to rely on the much more convenient mercenary model. There are lots of German mercenaries also among the ones that have arrived with Henry VII, who dies, and sort of these guys basically are hired by the major Ghibelline powers named Pisa, Milan, in fact, Verona. And the Milanese become a bit like they're the most powerful of the Italic kingdom, and as such they managed actually to crush the papal army that was just off Milan in Monza, right, just very close, a few tens of kilometers, and actually they win the war because one part of the Germans switch side from the papal to the Milanese army. And there are also troubles in Milan with the German mercenaries that try to take power, but essentially they will not succeed, like basically nowhere in Italy. This is interesting though, because from there on, the Milanese have understood how to handle these guys, and the Visconti managed to create the largest army in Italy that is mostly made up of these, at least as the core of the bulk of the force of the power, by these German mercenaries, which was quite interesting. Naturally, there was still the Milanese knights and the militia, etc. But gradually, right, given the power of this signory that is extending now on a very wide area, especially with the 14th century crisis and coldening of the cake, the Visconti managed to strengthen so much the dynastic position so that they become de facto the monarchs of Milan and of this broader area, right, the western part of the central Po Valley and beyond, right. They arrive in Tuscany, they're really aggressive, they're very militaristic as a regime. In fact, this is the moment in which the ideal archetypal divide between the Florentine liberty and republicanism is opposed to the Milanese tyranny and signory and whatever, and actually both believe that, that their own model being the best one, right? Tyrant was not used as it's overwhelmingly used today because of all the history of the term. At the time, objectively, the Milanese were also the most orderly, the best administered, the most state-like power in the Italic kingdom. Also, the stronger ones. Something this surely means. And you have that's why I was saying in the beginning, we can't descend into the details of the single Visconti rulers because they're very interesting in their own way. They are all men-at-arms by, say, vocation. I mean, some less, some more, but they have fundamentally that role. They have to command the Milanese army in the various challenges that present themselves, mostly revolving around the control of this or that commune that could rebel, could be besieged by another power, whatever. The della Scala are crushed by the Venetians and the Florentines, allied with their own mercenary army. This brings essentially, like, the della Scala continue ruling in Verona, but their very extensive seigneury stretching across the Apennine and northeastern Italy, reaching up to, in fact, the same Florence almost at the peak, right? Taking Lucca, other centers, collapses because Verona was not as state-like as Milan, so they had this exploit because they managed to exploit very well the situation, and they hated the Visconti. They were quite competitive with one another. There is all a German policy behind this as well. There were different houses in Germany, as you know, between the Habsburgs, the Bavarians, that all had, you know, their own horse to bet on in Italy, even though they still were sort of, in relation to the Pope, the competitive force. But there would be alliances even between the Luxembourgs and the Pope, the papal vicar, whatever. Milan was, however, at this point the most sheltered of these powers, the most powerful, the most compact. The Papal Crusade failed, and there was not a repetition of that because of the collapse of the della Scala. There is a problem because the Venetian Florentine mercenaries are disbanded and they're not paid, and this interferes with Milanese history in as much as the German troops of this company, has it been formed and named, the one of St. George, are subcontracted by the these are actually mercenaries from the della Scala as well, that are given to Luchino Visconti, that was the uncle of the current Lord of Milan, Azzone, who faces with the Milanese people and some Milanese allies this German mercenary force and destroys it, right, in Parabiago, again on February 21st, 1339. This is important because Azzone represents, again, a moment of further consolidation of seigneurial rule. He ruled over Milan between 1329 1339, and he is granted by the Milanese councils the title and rights of Dominus Generalis. So this happened in 1330, and clearly depicting the seigneurial character of this this regime. This allows the Visconti to establish a veritable state subject, by the way, to a single law. At least at this time, that the Visconti they command over so many cities that they are the ones who make more, but they're so very rich to make more progress in the administrative uniformation of all these various communes under the Milanese government, which is very complex, very long term. Like technically, these were all different communes that were ideally thinking of themselves as such, but they were fundamentally now disarmed under the Milanese that had defeated them and that could send like a hell of a force just to crush them had they arisen again. They don't serve militarily. Again, that's kind of how even in these communes many populace managed to self-sabotage and ending up not to pay taxes, but ending up, of course, conquered by the external force that, of course, the Milanese thank extremely much for. Because, of course, Milan is always the undisputed center, and ever more so thanks to this. And yet, there is a necessity to appoint certain officials to rule these cities, and since these are, if not Milanese, directly, at least some men of Milan, right, politically, there is also the attempt to sort of standardize the way these guys would rule from. There is also a great process of fortification within the city. The states, the Milanese built these massive castles in the, I don't know where the popular square was before, so to avoid uprisings, to keep the people out of the streets and rendering any attempt of resistance useless. Right, but to a large extent, of course, this is possible just because these people accept to be ruled by this strong man, rather than being committed and further struggle as the ones that in the first decades of the 14th century objectively they had put up, but being literally exhausted, right, in manpower, in agricultural resources. And the Milanese, especially their German mercenaries, were not quite tender people, right, just by inclination, personally. There is a legend about the Battle of Parabiago that is considered a bit like the swan song of the Milanese militia, because after this you have fundamentally the condottieri era, albeit communal forces were still there at some point. That is the appearance of Sant'Ambrose on horseback on this battlefield that was all kind of icy. It was full of snow and very difficult, and they fought like for 3 days, and it was a massacre. Like the Milanese won, but they took also many losses. And part of the Germans that were captured are also hired by the same Visconti. But anyway, and this legend of Ambrose appearing on horseback is depicted in a bronze relief on one of the cathedral doors. There is all a series of military events with also important crises during which the Visconti managed to reach even southern Tuscany, Umbria. Like that's how branched actually their power is extended towards the 50s, the 60s of the 14th century. They have reached this enormously extended dominion, which again was mostly, especially in the periphery, based on actually the need on the wake of the 14th century crisis of protection by certain communes. Like if you lived we've seen it in the video about Perugia, for example, that was one of the communes that fell under the Visconti, namely at this point. Like they were just having problems with the local nobility, like from the countryside, etc. They decide to call Visconti support. They provided them with some power. Yes, they also depleted their own as a consequence, but there was some autocratic rule within the same city that doesn't matter whether these guys came from the countryside or the city, they were still revolving around the city, would eventually become ever more something lordly, right, autocratic in nature. Gradually, again, it's all sort of painful to observe how this happened over time. And the Milanese, especially having a dynastic, say, regime, because the Visconti clan, aside from the clashes against one another, as we've seen before with the Battle of Parabiago, had of course locked their own power within their own clan. There was no one that could really simply rise to power without meeting with an important challenge, and also from the other members of the family could survive. Had never quite established an effective succession system, right? So when one lord died, and there were, his brothers who started fighting for power. Well, at that point, which clash that took mostly in place in Lombardy, if you were one of those guys in Umbria or in Romagna or in Tuscany, you would say, oh well, okay, who cares? Like this, the fact that this Visconti power collapses, they're free again. They know that those guys are committed elsewhere, and if you want to lock yourself within the city gates, it's not that from Milan they're going to besiege your own city, unless there is, of course, some local force that is going to do it for them or receiving their support, which was the case, right? But it did not equate to a conquest, right? Steamrolling permanent occupation and annexation. No, there was none of this, right? Theoretically, these guys were all within the Italian kingdom. They were all different communes, different city-states. They all had their prerogatives, and they maintain a bit the fiction of it all. And sometimes it was not fiction. It was they just had power on their own, and it was difficult to centralize in this circumstance. So at some point, for example, under the rule of Gian Galeazzo Visconti between 1385 and 1482, the Milanese signory came to include Verona, Montferrat, Perugia, that we just exemplified. Most of these were temporary. The real heartland of Visconti power being Lombardy proper. Right, even the right bank of the Po River, especially in places like Parma, Reggio, Modena, was a sort of a gray area in which the Venetians began to interfere toward the Este as well from the other side. It was complicated to simply control this, but because it was all about the city, right? Who does rule in the city? The local aristocracy that you're co-opting and that can simply open the gates to this other power depending on internal factional struggles. It's always the same story. The only difference being that compared to the 13th century, where every city has still the power to literally keep guys out in a individual sense, say starting from the city as a single and as an independent power. In the 14th century, you have just a handful of major powers that basically play with the smaller ones against one another, right? And the system is much more exhausted, like in the rest of Europe. In 1359, Galeazzo II ordered the construction of a canal for Pavia to irrigate the so-called Visconti Park. It was a green area extending from Pavia's Visconti Castle to the modern Certosa of Pavia. These are magnificent landmarks of Lombardy. Then there was another aqueduct stemming from the Adda River to irrigate Galeazzo's estate near the Jovian Gate in the same Milan. The first of these canals was the so-called Navigliaccio, right? While traces of a second no longer remain, it is possible that they were covered by the Martesana Naviglia, which was later constructed in the same area. In any case, these major infrastructural works were possible just because of the enormous financial power of the Milanese signory, together with all these massive fortifications of the largest cities that were under their control. So again, infrastructure that was meant to remain and to facilitate all, as we've seen, the development of the dominion, the industries, and this is why this area would historically also remain so developed, even when it lost its independence during the Italian wars. Right, it was still like a major producer, for example, of armor, of glass, like the Italian of the Spanish dominion never went out. Also, under the Habsburgs, the Austrians later on in the 18th century, this was actually the richest part of the Habsburgic Empire. So it makes you think, really. All this power had, however, extinguished, as we were saying before, a great part of the same Milanese liberty. Yes, there were important, powerful Milanese families and groups, etc., but most of the system had been properly subjugated to the lordship that was again managing and also providing, as you've seen, for all these guys. But it's again very different from the much greater power distribution that had occurred, had been the normal system and since the foundation of the commune, right? This is by the 14th century past, right? The Visconti obtained the title of Dukes of Milan in 1396. This was recognized by the Holy Roman Emperor. These elevations to properly imperial feudality, not just imperial vicaries, right, was quite important internationally. The Milanese, as you know, were marrying to French royalty. They had a great international weight, and they, generally speaking, were fostering and part of those banking activities that were at the basis of, as we've seen in the video about Italian banking recently, of probably the balance of Western Europe. Milan was again one of the great powers in the continent that would affect in its expansionist policy a bit like the entire balance in Italy, and again influencing heavily also the choices of the other powers, etc. Milan was definitely the capital of an extensive, powerful, and wealthy state. It also needed symbols to affirm its hegemonic role. Gian Galeazzo, for example, desired for his city a cathedral that would rival the greatest in Europe, and that's how the Milanese cathedral, in fact, began in 1386. You know that in Europe we mostly terminated our cathedrals much later on, because again they began in the 12th to the 14th century, and these were massive works that were just to be completed over generations, and they were just funded continuously because this brought lots of people to work, and it was just a greater benefit for everybody. But then the mid-14th century crisis strikes, and so basically these working sites stopped to a degree, and the Milanese cathedral would be completed in the 19th century. I mean, in the broader structure it was there, just like most cathedrals, but the pinnacles, the tower, in many European monuments were sort of completed much later on. In fact, the Duomo of Milan is notorious one of the more varied, complex architectural, artistic buildings in Europe, because it dates to these different eras in a very composite fashion. The full name of the cathedral is the Metropolitan Cathedral Basilica of Saint Mary Rising, being born like it's dedicated to the Virgin, whose statue dominates, in fact, the city. And it was entirely covered in Candolia marble, which had been transported via the Great Naviglio. So thanks to this major infrastructural capabilities. For in fact, the village of Candolia was located on the western shore of Lake Maggiore, which this it was just 400 meters away, the Naviglio, right? The sides, the caves of marble, etc. And so the connection with Milan was that eased up by this waterway. Also, this made the ditch surrounding the Milanese walls navigable, narrowing it, deepening it, transforming it into the circle of the Navigli, so that the greater Naviglio was extended, digging a dock, the pond of St. Stephen, where all the necessary construction materials arrived. Right? So just to move all the marble, they built all this other waterways and infrastructure over it, and so adding further value to the city, to the defenses, etc. In all this, again, we can't descend into every single, even of major, very important political issues that were taking place at the time. Venice, for example, had began to set foot in the terraferma, and as you know, had been expanding quite fast and quite efficiently, even more than the Milanese to some extent, up to Bergamo. It is very close to Milan, and that was threatening the entire like probably the Milanese heartland quite directly. This went in parallel with the involvement of many other signories, from the Gonzaga to the Este and more. This is the age of the condottieri. So there is this phenomenon with the 14th century crisis of partial shrinking of at least of larger communal forces, the maintenance of this pretty robust corps of men-at-arms and their retinues that gradually evolved, especially in the 15th century. Again, major armies again. These guys cost a lot, but they are quite effective after all. At the Battle of Governolo in 1397, the Milanese are defeated by the Venetian-led coalition against that had mobilized against the Visconti, and this really puts an end to a great deal of Milanese expansion ambitions, right? Also the possibility of kicking out the Venetians from such close places. Making the long story short, as you know, this is the major deal. The rule of the Visconti family came to an end with the death of Filippo Maria in 1447. He's been a hell of a ruler. I made a video about him, right, and the important relations with Florence, with the papacy. This was a quite delicate moment because the French were about to win the 100 Years' War, and everybody knew that the renewed Capetian power would have expanded under the Valois quite soon in other lands. And so the Milanese that had historically been married into, again, the French royalty, which eventually created the premises even for many of the Italian wars, casus belli, for succession to the same Milan, was making, in fact, the Milanese aware that the next target of a reunified French kingdom would have been the same Milan. This brought to the Milanese support to the Aragonese in southern Italy, where the last Angevins were taken out because of the green light that the Milanese gave. Like, without the Milanese support, the Aragonese could have not taken. They tried, right, to take Naples, but they failed. The second they even captured the Aragonese ruler, and they talked with, say, Milan when he was prisoner, etc. And it was a general understanding that, however, curbing French power would have been at that point more advantageous for Milan. The most important aspect of Filippo Maria's death was notoriously the fact that he died without male heirs, right? So it's his daughter that would be married to this very powerful condottiere of humble origins, Francesco Sforza, that began, in fact, the Sforza dynasty in Milan. This had occurred, by the way, in a moment in which the city of Milan had tried to repristinate some sort of republican government. This was actually the only time in which the people in Milan, so the exception that confirms the rule, ever ruled. The name of the government was the Golden Ambrosian Republic, which was also very classical sounding. But Lombardy, again, wasn't a people's land. It was mostly like the great lords of the region that mattered. And in fact, the same Francesco Sforza stifles in 1450 such experiment. It was just all within Milan and could not compete with the strong autocratic apparatus that could have even been used by this regime, but it was too fragmented. Like, it was, again, incongruent with this other type of managing power, so it could never be efficient at it. The Sforza takes over thanks to his military coup. He had already been a commander of company of mercenaries for the Visconti. He married the heiress of Filippo Maria Visconti, and he established his own rule, the one of his family, which opened, as you know, also in Milanese history, to a period of stability and prosperity, during which, like, things as, let's say, as refined may seem banal, but still, like, in terms of economy, it's relevant, the cultivation of mulberry trees and silk production were particularly boosted, right, and flourishing on the markets. There was a manifestation of pride for the Milanese accomplishment in general. For example, the Sforza castle that had previously existed during the Visconti era, as well as the castle the Jovian Gate, was but now adapted, enlarged, and completed by the Sforza, was in fact established. Is the massive structure I also inserted many pictures of in this video. Also, the major hospital of Milan was established. These were clear manifestations of a crypto-royal, say, force, right? These are the same years of the Medici, of, let's say, this de facto monarchies, right, within still what appear to be republican regimes, at least also Milan. But historiography is sometimes very approximative when defining these institutions, because they were complex and are not easily frameable just in one or the other. Surely Milan had a more autocratic and sort of monarchic and tyrannical, if you want, type of regime. But it's not that the Medici in Florence were de facto not a monarchic power, even though still the city was a republic. It worked with a particular way, but basically the Medici and banks had taken over the entire city. This Sforza, for this reason, also managed to attract personalities to Milan, such as the same Leonardo da Vinci, who redesigned and improved the function of the Navigli, thanks to his, as you know, massive engineering capacities. He painted there the Last Supper, so, you know, just this alone tells you the caliber of the Sforza court, right? And Milan is definitely a great capital of, especially of the Renaissance. This Leonardo, for example, was very connected with mostly military engineering, technology in general. But you have Bramante as well, who worked on the Church of St. Mary near St. Satyrus, the Basilica of St. Ambrose, and the Church of St. Mary of the Graces. This would influence remarkably the development of the Lombard Renaissance, and together with it the Italian and the European one. So Milan, great capital of the Renaissance, embodying that courtly model that was definitely taking root so much in Italy, but was already proper of the greater monarchies of Europe, that Milan is the one that sort of resembles the most within the Italic kingdom. At the same time, the Sforza family carried out expansionist actions in northern and central Italy, as usual. I also made a video about the Battle of Molinella that sort of exemplified these clashes in these very years. The Venetians were the natural enemy of Milan by this point. The same Medici of Lorenzo the Magnificent were among their opponents, right? Essentially, the triangle here had been like Venice and Florence against Milan, right? Because the latter was the largest power, and these were sort of the only bulwarks that could put like around there, looking at the size, the scale of these various powers, like a successful resistance against them, the others being smaller seigneuries that somewhat depended on the balance. Think about, I don't know, the Gonzaga of Mantua, just in between Venice and Milan. At that point, needing to militarize, I made a video about how, in fact, at this point, certain Italian lords become proper, not just, they're already, as we explained, men-at-arms by vocation and lifestyle and background, but they, in the case of the Gonzaga, they become condottieri proper. That is to say, they can't be hired by these other rulers that also in fact, their own best men. Here, the Sforza, as you see, manage even to take power. But for example, the Dal Verme had their own castle in some areas, like they're supported by Milan. And this is, let's say, not feudalism, but something very similar to it overall. And so it's not really much different from how other great powers, especially in the 15th century, had come to work, right? It's in 1426 that the expansionist policies of the Doge of Venice, Francesco Foscari, become the most difficult for Milan, right? The Venetians declare a war against the duchy, and on October the 17th, 1427, they managed to win over the Milanese at the Battle of Maclodio, thanks to the exploit of the Count of Carmagnola. This is the moment in which the Venetians managed to push their power until Bergamo in the west. So the Adda River, which was again but very close to Milan, and this is a very serious threat, just politically and strategically, which means also that the cities of the Lombard cities of Brescia, Crema, the territories of the Camonica Valley, will be part of the Venetian dominion. In fact, on some of these territories, like Venice would maintain its control for good, right, until Napoleon. And it came at the expenses of the Milanese, right? These were two major powers, again, that the Venetians had, especially together with the Burgundians of Charles the Bold, essentially the best army of their generation. The Venetian condotta being much more like practically subcontracted through this sort of feudal system, that the Venetians were also much more tolerant on the local communal autonomies, right? It's not that they were less iron-fisted than the Milanese, but they had a more practical way just of dealing with a dominion that was also relatively new at this point, so they left the original mark of their, say, maritime republican mindset over how to deal with these terra firma possessions. As all great powers at this point, of course, it was an important foundation for the stability of the state, but at the same time, we're talking, again, the 15th century, every major monarchy, original power, whatever, is always a step away from collapsing or having sort of internal upheavals, and albeit Milan remains the stronger power in its region, the international situation is becoming ever altered, more complicated. There is, especially between the mid-15th and the mid-16th century, the greatest important changes. They go as far as 1535, differently from some of our historical regional series episodes. Not much, because we're going to cover everything in detail, right? Or we just must actually, again, this is a very, very, very short introduction for Milan, because it sort of shows you how the process of how the Milanese would remain under first the Spanish. There had been the French, there had been all, the Italian wars, but fundamentally would pass through the hands of the Habsburgs into the state that remained until the Italian unification. All right. Archbishops, you may think, have all the things to discuss in the world. Think about archbishops. Yes, they are important. There are some important figures. Charles I from Forlì, for example, Stephen of the Nardini were counts from Forlì. You were talking the second half of the the 15th century and the first one of the 16th. Giovanni Arcimboldi and Guid'Antonio Arcimboldi, Ottaviano of the same family, then Ippolito I of Este, Ippolito II of Este, were again, of course, coming from the other, essentially the third most important northern Italian power on the Adriatic side. You have, of course, among the most important rulers, Louis the Moor, like Ludovico il Moro. Milan under this ruler was at its peak, like in terms of Renaissance splendor, even though the crisis was just behind the corner. Ludovico conferred to the city one of the most modern and efficient welfare systems of the time, with the affirmation of the congregation and then the amount of piety in 1483. This was essentially a donation to the poor, to the needy. It was effectively a bank, like it had significant taxes of interest, but it was designed to help, in fact, those who really needed. That's why it's also so important. It existed it would spread as a model these years in other cities, and it's at the threshold of the modern age you realize there is a part of the people that is ever more sort of disconnected, marginated, and big cities especially must absorb this demographically in some way just to sustain them socioeconomically. As you know, in 1499 the French troops of Louis II entered Milan, and Ludovico tried to regain control of the city and sort of the one of the dynasty on the Milanese throne, and he even succeeded in February 1500, albeit ultimately losing at the Battle of Novara in the following April. So Milan was once again under French rule. They boasted again the properly rights from Visconti times, also because of the Sforza succession, like by at least initial, like for the elder female connection, right, of the Visconti with the House of France, right, then Bianca Maria had done with Sforza. And this Milan at some point was even handed over to the Swiss troops on June the 10th, 1512. They eventually, the Swiss were defeated at Marignano, and this brought to the end of their Milanese adventure, because and to their own benefit, because if the Swiss had maintained Milan, they would have not been the state they are today. They would have had a completely different history. They would have probably not been as successful. Instead, they handed it back to the Sforza family, Duke Maximilian, saying 1512, December the 29th. Maximilian was not particularly successful as a ruler. The people especially were not satisfied with his policies, and this brought to the erosion of his own dynastic power to the city magistrates. These issues were going on in 1515, and this events, however, were just happening in a background in which foreign rule would have just followed eventually, which occurred in fact with the victory at Marignano, which put out the Swiss out of the Milanese game again. The French regained control of Milan, and they held the city for a decade. During 1521-23, Charles V's imperial forces managed to retake it. Then the French control it again, and after the capture of the King of France, Francis I, at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, again the Sforza are reintroduced by the Imperials, because these were, you see, technically those that the Habsburgs had backed historically against the French penetration in what was in fact the Holy Roman Empire, right? At least dynastically there had been these quarrels. The Sforza came to power with Francis II. In 1526, however, the city revolted to this rule, and the Imperials took it over in the same year. So after the death of the Sforza line in 1535, Milan and then the duchy became part of the Habsburgic dominions. The Spanish forces fundamentally occupied. It's a series of Spanish governors that, until the War of Spanish Succession, in fact, will rule over Lombardy, Milan, because otherwise, this was, of course, the most important part. It was very important for the Spanish route to Flanders, as well. All the passages again through the Alps had been secured by the Milanese state. So by controlling that, the Spanish had really what they needed. Otherwise, Venice, as you know, Savoy, Tuscany, and the Papacy, even though remaining within, generally speaking, the Spanish orbit, they are independent countries. Southern Italy instead is in the hands of the islands, in the hands of the Spanish as well, ruled by again local nobility, but right as vice realms of Spain, or the crown of Aragon, technically, as at least the two crowns had not been really unified, merged into one another. So the history of Milan is fascinating because of its wealth, of its geographical location, its industries, its military power, its Renaissance court, its in fact also technological achievements. As we've seen, this all the various canals around the city, also for the transportation of building materials, etc., are really impressive. The city is again basically the largest, together with Paris, in medieval Europe. In the West, at least, you want to appreciate that, and this is all something which, again, whenever I make these videos about the Italian city-states, it's always difficult to deliver the right sense of compactness that these powers really represented against the concept of, again, chronic fragmentation and whatever, because it wasn't actually a more fragmented area than others in Europe at all, but in fact, not passing through this single powers doesn't quite make you understand that. You see these names as just the city names, for example. This is very interesting about the Italian, in fact, regional states, that they are centered on the city, right? They are governed provincially, like locally, through the cities that are conquered, however, by a major city. And so, in order to understand the differences, etc., I don't see. You see, it's difficult, perhaps, to explain it. But if you get the essentials that I'm giving you here, just by the scale of relevance, try to think on YouTube how or when you have ever listened to an explanation as simple as this one, but simple as, concrete about these powers. I personally haven't found anything on this topic on YouTube ever. Right? This is also one of the reasons why I do so. Right? It's just like, of course, pretty much everything I do on Schwerpunkt. I will not be modest about this, but that's what shocks me after all, because I realized that this platform may not be exactly the most let's say the most relevant, like to talk history at this, after all, quite modest level, but still, say a serious one at least. It's sort of strange that nobody kind of gets into these topics, right? You have an incredibly narrow set of focus that say of topics that pop culture focuses on, and you can't properly even understand, given the immensity of history that exists overall, like, in general, but also in this single polities in Europe. You realize, but why? Like, couldn't you make, like, it seems always to me that even adults get hyped, like children emotionally, about, I don't know, certain movies or certain, combat scenes, whatever. Like, if you get hyped for so few, I mean, I don't mean you personally, because I know that here we are a bit more selective, but the idea is, like, how can't you understand that history was full of this stuff to a level that nobody ever even told you? Like, and with a level of equivalence that you somehow don't take into consideration when, say, expressing the criterion through which we should be interested in this or that topic. That's the thing that amazes me the most. And what I've learned always studying the Italian signories, the Italian communes, is how true this is, just because of like some major historiographical, cultural, or even linguistical choices that were arbitrarily poured out into the broader media with the internet and all, and that have left major chapters, that not secondary ones, as if we really focused on just what matters hierarchically, and then no, just literally a minor part, also containing, of course, important issues, no doubt, but that sort of excluded all these others. This is not, you see, I understand the feeling when it's like non-Western stuff. Like, let's study the history of China. Yes, it's cool. I make lots of videos on that. I care about it, and I want to know it by myself. But at the same time, here it makes you think: how can Westerners have it if they don't, like, even within the same West, they don't sort of know anything about the broader picture? They have been grown up by a generation of memes, of video games, and practically nothing else, like in terms of very basic elementary information about their own countries, about, of course, the neighboring ones and more. That's the thing that scares me. That's the thing, especially the regional history series is aiming at, of course, fixing that. Well, if the channel was larger, of course, that may even have an important impact, but at least highlighting, because again, I don't see it anywhere else, and that's the sort of scary thing at the end of the day. It's how much emptiness, like in a world that theoretically can produce infinite information, evaluating them, modifying in it, whatever. None of this actually focuses on actual structural, systemic, founded knowledge. No, it's about an ever shallower, sort of limited and blind sense of, okay, now I will pick this card among the many, and for no reason except maybe, I don't know, I think it looks cool in graphics, and it's not even that I will make my life about it, but if I have to think about something, I will just look at this and all the rest doesn't matter, because I'm too lazy, right? That's not a great way to go, really. As far as Milanese history is concerned, of course, I'm glad here I'm covering. I usually make, I don't know if you noticed that, like how the cycle works for the series, but let's say at least for the Italian part, I am following now, because there are also other regions, fiefs, other important provinces to look at. But now I've been, for a couple of years, I've been sticking to the single city-states, like city after city. So Milan here, of course, deserved 2 chapters. And again, it's even few, because this one I made it much of a synthesis than the others. Probably pass to Florence next, because I realized I also never made like a fully fledged video on Florence, like at least in a dimensional sense. So we have to fix that. I plan to boost the Italian history content more, also from the military side of the story, because we ain't always up talking about this sort of institutional things and maybe the city's history, but you never see the actual action behind that. So again, I'm glad to have covered Milan. I'm glad I've started to cover some Milanese cities. I think the only one I make is Cremona, but I've made is Cremona, but like just from this video you understand how many there were. Except, yeah, okay, well, we will see for each one how much information we're able to to draw, because it's it's even sometimes difficult to organize all of this in a decent fashion. In any case, just expect more Milanese history in general. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.